Okay, we're going to do the last section in this chapter on the South. And this one is for Section 3, and it is on the slave system. All right. Some of the terms you're going to hear are Nat Turner's Rebellion, spirituals, Nat Turner, and folk tales. The slave system in the South produced harsh living conditions and occasional rebellions. Slaves did work at a variety of jobs on the plantations. Not always did slaves live on plantations, though, so don't think that. Life under slavery was difficult and very dehumanizing. The slave culture, they did kind of have their own subculture and shared certain characteristics and traditions within their own communities that they would form, on plantations. And sometimes their owners would let them socialize between different plantations. And slave uprisings led to stricter slave codes in many states. Most slaves lived in rural areas on small farms or plantations. And we kind of talked about that in the previous section about how some people only owned a few slaves. And slaves were also owned in the North. It's not just the South, and they were in the North. Eventually, that would kind of go away, and not as many had slaves in the North. And we always think of the South as where slavery was really prominent because it was. On small farms, they did a variety of jobs, and on plantations, they were assigned specific jobs. Most worked in the fields, but the women would care for the children, take care of the house. Slaveholders did want them to work as much as possible. And there were supervisors and drivers that made sure that slaves followed orders and carried out the punishments. And sometimes the drivers were slaves themselves. So there was a hierarchy of different freedoms that the slaves would get. Some were able to maybe even not sleep and live at the plantation. Maybe they had their own home with their family and they came back during the day and worked. So it just depended on the plantation, the owner, and what kind of freedoms the slaves had earned. The gang labor system is all field hands worked on the same task at the same time. They would work sun up to sundown, and men, women, and children older than 10 did the same task all day long. Sickness and poor weather rarely stopped the work. So basically, if they were told to work, they did, unless they were dying. If you worked in the planter's home, sometimes that was a little more prestigious within the slaves. They worked as butlers and cooks and nurses. So the closer you were with the family, the higher that family, the owner, held you if you were a slave. So slaves in the home usually had better food, clothing, and shelter than the field hands. And that just makes sense because if you were working in the home and serving the family, if they had visitors coming in, they didn't want the slaves to look, ragged and torn and dirty. They wanted them to look very nice, clean, well kept, so their guest wouldn't kind of look down on them. They did work longer hours in the home, and they served the planter's family around the clock. Large plantations had some slaves work skilled jobs like blacksmith and carpentry. Sometimes they were allowed to sell their services to other people, and some would earn enough to buy their freedom eventually. So some were able to gain freedom from saving up money, and eventually, once they did that, most would not stay in the South. They would try to get to the North just in case someone tried to take them in again under their will or against their will. Slaveholders viewed slaves as property, not people, and this will become a huge deal leading into the Civil War and then during Reconstruction when everybody's coming back together to try to mend the country. They were bought and sold to make a profit. They were auctioned off, and families were often torn apart during the auctions. So sometimes they're not willing to pay someone that's purchasing a slave is not willing to pay for an entire family, but rather just one slave to fill a position. And if that was the case, and there was a father and a mother and maybe 3 children, maybe they only wanted the male for his work that he could do. And they would just take him, and then, they might not ever see each other again. They're separated with little hope of ever getting back together. And the freed slaves were sometimes kidnapped and sold into slavery. The living conditions. Obviously, the living conditions are poor for a majority of the slaves. They lived, especially in the plantations, dirt floor cabins, few furnishings. Sometimes many would share a bedroom or a little hut of a home. The cheap clothing was given to them. Some were allowed to keep their own gardens for vegetables and chickens for eggs. And some were allowed to fish or pick wild berries. So that was like their outing that they would get. And here's a short little video to show you this.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is
and of course, we're going to get an ad pop up.
And hard to.
Life for an African American held as a slave in the southern United States between the years 1619 and 1860 was one of extreme hardship and injustice. African Americans living as slaves had no freedoms of their own, owned no property, received no pay, were beaten or whipped for disobedience, and were bought and sold like animals. The large plantations in the South survived on slave labor. African Americans worked the fields, tended to the animals and farm chores, and worked in the plantation homes as cooks, housekeepers, seamstresses, servants, and nannies, receiving nothing in return but inadequate food and shelter. African Americans who were held as house slaves had somewhat better treatment than those who worked in the fields, though African Americans who worked in the plantation homes were treated more as pets than people. African American families could be split up and sold at auction depending on the needs of their owners. A large plantation in the southern states could have as many as 100 African Americans working the day-to-day chores. African Americans were controlled by the overseer, who woke them at dawn and often worked them until dark. African Americans who didn't obey the overseer could be badly mistreated and beaten. Slave quarters were built separately and away from the main plantation house. These quarters were usually one room, dirt floor cabins with a fireplace. In some cases, African Americans living as slaves were allowed to have small gardens, pigs, and chickens by their cabins. This helped to give them healthier diets, but often the overseers left them very little time in the day to tend these gardens. An African American born as a slave on a plantation could live out his or her whole life there. They might never see the world outside of the plantation boundaries. Their days would be dedicated to serving their owner, never receiving payment or freedom.
All right. The slave code was obviously going to be very strict set of rules for the slaves to follow. The planters offered more food and better living conditions to encourage obedience by the slaves. So they would purposely, if someone was very obedient and followed and did everything they said and didn't try to rebel, they would show how they maybe would get to eat a meal in the home or go stay in the home or work in the home. And if someone was not obedient, that is when they would lynch and beat the slaves out in public so the others could see on the plantations, to kind of warn them, like, don't go against our rules, don't try to be disobedient, otherwise this could happen to you. Punishment is or was very widely used. Some states passed strict laws called slave codes, and that prohibited them from traveling far from their homes, prohibited the education of slaves, so they could not gain a public education at all. And they would fine and whip anyone caught teaching enslaved people to read and write, whether that was an African American or a white citizen. So slave codes were purposely written to keep slaves in check and to keep them from going against their owners. Slave culture, they found comfort in their own community and culture. Family was the most important aspect of slave communities. They feared separation because, like as we talked about before, they can be separated in a split second during an auction. Parents kept their heritage alive by passing down family histories as well as African customs and traditions. And most of them, if they did not know how to read and write, they had to just pass down their stories and traditions through storytelling. Many slaves were Christian. They held faith that they would someday live in freedom. They had spirituals, and those were emotional Christian songs that blended African and European music. They blended their African religions with those of the Christianities that the slaveholders followed. And they worshiped in secret and out of sight of the slaveholders. Now, with rebellion, they were gaining freedom by escaping to the north, and some would maybe get a chance to do that, but they knew the chance of them reaching the north successfully without getting caught or possibly killed was very slim. It was very hard to do that. If found, they were captured and sent back to their slaveholders, and they faced harsh punishments or death. Thousands were successful in escaping, but it was very difficult to do so. Uprisings were violent slave revolts, and they were very rare. The white Southerners lived in fear of them happening because if you looked at population wise, there were more slaves than there were whites. So if they were to get together and rebel or cause an uprising, manpower wise, they'd have the advantage over overthrowing their owners and the whites. They planned rebellions sometimes, but they were usually stopped before they even began out of fear or whatever reason. Nat Turner's rebellion was the most violent slave revolt that occurred in 1831. Nat Turner was a slave from Virginia, and he believed God had told him to end slavery, so he led a group of slaves in a plan to kill all the slaveholders and their families in the county. He first attacked the family that held him as a slave, and he soon killed 60 white people in the community. There were more than 100 innocent slaves that were not involved, and they were killed in an attempt to stop the rebellion. Turner was actually caught after a 6-week chase. He was brought to trial. He made a confession and expressed his belief that the revolt was justified and worth his death. He was executed on November 11th of 1831, and after the rebellion, many states strengthened their slave codes, making them even harder on the slaves. And the new codes placed stricter control on enslaved people. So this is about 30 years before the Civil War even begins. So that is the end of our discussion on the slave system, slave culture, during that time leading up to the Civil War. Please fill out your notes activity sheet for this last section. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Leave a comment in the comments section where it was posted on Classroom. Thank you.